Well, hello, everybody. So most of you know me. I'm Professor Jim Franklin. I'm the chair of the Department of Politics and Government. And I'm here to introduce our speaker for the 33rd Annual John Kennard Eddy Memorial Lecture on World Politics. I'll tell you a little bit about the series first. This lectureship is in memory of John Kennard Jeff Eddy, who was a politics and government major at OU in the late 1980s. And Jeff had a keen interest in international affairs, and he and two of his classmates were driving up to a Russian studies seminar at Oberlin when their car was struck by a reckless driver, killing them. His parents, John and the late Ellen Eddy, generously contributed to start this lectureship. And the lectureship has been a fitting memorial to Jeff's interests, and it's a gift that keeps giving to us at Ohio Wesleyan, allowing us to bring in some leading scholars in international relations for many years. So this is just a wonderful legacy for us here at Ohio Wesleyan University. Our speaker tonight is Professor Navin Bapat. I'll tell you a little bit about him. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from what we in Ohio call the School Up North, University of Michigan. He has a master's and Ph.D. in political science from Rice University. He is the Dowd Professor in the Study of Peace and War at the University of North Carolina, and also there the chair of the Curriculum of Peace, War, and Defense. He's a prolific researcher in diverse areas of international relations, especially economic sanctions and terrorism. He'll be, maybe talking from both, but especially about terrorism this evening. He spoke in one of my classes today about economic sanctions, and it was a very interesting talk as well. He's the author of the book Monsters to Destroy: Understanding the War on Terror, published in 2019 on Oxford University Press. He's also published 25 peer-reviewed articles as well as many other reviews, and he's done a multitude of presentations. A couple things about the timing. We scheduled this a few months ago, and back then the U.S. leaving Afghanistan was the big issue. Of course, things change quickly in international politics, and so much attention is on Ukraine now, but we shouldn't lose attention to issues like Afghanistan and the war on terror. Those remain important issues. And also, I didn't realize at first that this was the evening of the national championship in men's basketball, and especially that our speaker would end up being a professor at one of the colleges playing in this championship. Fortunately, we realized that game is later on tonight, so I was glad to see that that game does not start till later on. I'm sorry, so please join me in welcoming Professor Bapat.
Thank you very much, Professor Franklin, and thank you all for inviting me here to give this lecture. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to do so. So the title of the talk that I'm going to give to all of you this evening is called Afghanistan and the End of the War on Terror. And what I want to talk to you about first, just in line with what Professor Franklin was saying, is that although we are focusing quite a bit more on Ukraine, and although what is happening in Ukraine is a tragedy, there is a humanitarian catastrophe happening right now in Afghanistan. And I feel like the U.S. and a lot of the media in the world has lost sight of that. And I think it's often when we see images of Afghan suffering, that can get papered over for whatever reason. But I think the statistics actually tell the story, in this case, quite a bit better. So according to the International Rescue Committee's report on February 9th, an astounding 97% of Afghans today are living at the poverty line. Many more are forecasted to be there by mid-2022, and the estimate is that Afghanistan is heading for a close to 100% poverty rate by mid-2022. which is astounding. I don't think that I've, in my time researching political science, ever seen a state that has had 100% poverty level. I don't think I've ever seen that, and I don't know if anyone has, but that truly is astounding when we think about that level of poverty. What makes it worse is that Afghans are not only suffering from poverty, they're suffering from hunger. So as of February 20th, a report by the UN and the World Food Program, 95% of Afghans don't have enough food to eat, which means they're not consuming enough calories to sustain life. So we're seeing Afghans suffer economically, we're also seeing them suffer in terms of malnutrition, which again is tragic, which is a tragedy, but then on top of that, there really doesn't seem to be any sign of improvement anywhere. The banking system has fallen into complete collapse. The economic system is falling into collapse. There's no capital going in to Afghanistan. So this is a situation that is dire, right? And the situation is growing day by day at an exponential rate. So I want that to be sort of up in front, that that's what Afghanistan is today. That's what has been left there at the end of the war on terror. So I think the question I want to talk to you about today is, given where Afghanistan is, given what's been left, how did we get to this point? And when I say we, I mean all of us. I mean Americans, the globe, Afghans in particular. How did we all get to this point where Afghanistan is substantially suffering in this way at the end of 20 years of war? And there's a couple of different explanations for how the United States entered into Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks. So I want to go over a few of them and then present an explanation from my research, and let's focus more specifically on Afghanistan and Pakistan's experience in the war on terror. One of the first explanations is that this is structural in U.S. foreign policy, that the U.S. is engaged in multiple overseas commitments. This was just one of them that went wrong. And so as a result of that, Afghanistan has fallen apart. And the cause of that is really underlying issues that are associated in American foreign policy. A second part of it is the 9/11 attacks in particular, that 9/11 politicized this phenomenon called terrorism, which is very, very old. Terrorism is not something new, right? And likely will continue well on after this date, even though the war on terror seems to have officially ended. Actually, the growth of the war on terror seems to be more in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment. But terrorism is an old phenomenon, but terrorism was significantly politicized after 9/11. And more than that, the necessity to protect Americans indefinitely from terrorism was highly politicized after 9/11. And the third cause of that, of what we're observing today, which is related to the fourth, is that what I will argue to you is that there were fundamental issues in the strategy that caused problems for the United States in Afghanistan. I don't think these were all foreseen. I think there were significant efforts to try to address some of these as the operation went on, but there were some fundamental flaws in what the United States was trying to do in Afghanistan, which was exacerbated in particular by what Pakistan wanted to do. One thing that I think the United States missed was an understanding of what their Pakistani ally was actually trying to accomplish in Afghanistan. So I want to hit on all of these as we go through and begin just by what we observed on 9/11. So the 9/11 terrorist attacks, if you go through terrorism data and you look at terrorist attacks globally, as long as we've collected information on them, they are a significant outlier, and their damage and their scope and their scale has been unprecedented and has since been unprecedented. There hasn't been anything like 9/11 since, thankfully. And I can say just personally, I was born in New York, and so I remember watching this, and I remember that feeling of anger. And I remember that visceral sickness when I saw the towers come down, because as a kid, I always looked at those things, and they were always a symbol to me of the city and a symbol of the opportunity that my family got in coming to New York. And so seeing it shattered in that way, and shattered so spectacularly and shattered so quickly, and seeing people jumping out of the buildings, and seeing all the rescue workers roaming around and trying to find someone to save in those moments, and they were covered in ash, seeing those images was profoundly shocking. And it's been a long time, right? And many of you may have grown up after 9/11, so that memory's not there. But I just want you to, for a second, think about what it was like to see that, especially if you had a connection to the city, if you had a connection to somebody that was there. It was brutally painful, right, to see that. And so one argument was that the images of that day, the shock of that day, and the uncertainty of that day, and bear in mind, these 4 attacks happened that day, right? We had the 2 in New York, the 1 at the Pentagon, the 1 that went down in Pennsylvania. There was no guarantee that another one wasn't coming on September 12th. There was no guarantee another one wasn't coming on September 13th or the next week or the next week after. Americans, I think I can say this fairly securely, were scared at this point because you didn't know what was going to happen next. So I think that fear, one argument is that fear necessitated some response. And so what the United States did was try to respond to this new normal, as former Vice President Cheney called it, where terrorism was going to be the most significant foreign policy threat that the United States was facing. And that perhaps terrorists had developed this new capability to strike at the United States in a way that, honestly, no other foreign power had, right, since World War II. Perhaps the threat of terrorism really was that significant. And that's something we can think about after 9/11. But what I want to do is to sort of test that hypothesis. That's what I believed after 9/11, to be perfectly honest. After 9/11, I hadn't seen anything like that. Terrorism seemed like it was going to be a big deal to me, and so I continued to focus on this. But as I did, I started to collect a lot of data on it, and I started to try to compare it to other risks that Americans face on a daily basis. And what it turns out is that if we look at from this data, the dashed line at the top are the number of Americans killed annually from motor vehicle accidents. The solid line at the bottom, and that red line is 2001 when 9/11 happened. The solid line at the bottom are the number of Americans killed annually as a result of terrorist attacks. And what you can see fairly starkly is if we look at the data, it is not close. Terrorists and most years, again, if we examine the data globally, kill a few thousand people. That's what we look at when we look at the data. Motor vehicle accidents just in the United States kill tens of thousands of people annually. So when you compare the two phenomena, motor vehicle accidents are far more deadly and far more of a risk to Americans than terrorism ever could be, right? You could double and triple the risk of terrorism, it still would not be close. Motor vehicle accidents are far more significant, yet there is a war on terror. There was a war on terror. There was no war on motor vehicle accidents, right? There was no war on traffic safety. All right, so that's interesting because that's not what you would think after 9/11. It's certainly not what I thought after 9/11, but the data are the data, and against those are US government numbers. They're clear. So what that suggests is that maybe these attacks are doing something very deadly. Maybe these attacks are something to be avoided. Maybe they kill so many Americans that we need to be concerned about that. Maybe these groups are indeed more deadly than we thought. But when we look at the data on them, again, we don't see that either. Right, so when we look at the data on terrorist groups, what we can see, and we have a lot of information on this after the war on terror, that we've collected a lot of information on Al-Qaeda and its cells and ISIS and their cells, they're really dysfunctional. And I really do mean this. If you go through and look at some documents on terrorist communications, you'll see they're often fighting over very petty things. They often can't really keep track of their finances. They often get messages wrong. And they often fall apart pretty easily. And it typically happens somewhere within 4 to 6 years. The groups fall apart without accomplishing any one of their objectives. That's what they are. Less than 10% ever accomplish any of their objectives. So I just want to recap that. Terrorists, on average, again, based on the data, have never really killed a whole lot of people. Every one of the people they do kill is an absolute tragedy, and I don't want to play light with that. It's a tragedy. But they don't kill that many people. They also tend to fall apart without accomplishing anything. They don't accomplish their strategic objectives, and they're fighting amongst themselves. So how does this justify a long-standing 20-year war on terror that has killed more people than died on 9/11? That's the question, I think, that we want to think about. How did we get to that point when we're basically willing to continue a war that was so costly to the United States, even though the risk, when we really look at it and look at it objectively, not the way I looked at it after 9/11, not the way many of us looked at it after 9/11, but look at it objectively, using logic, facts, reason, data, it doesn't seem to be that big a risk, and yet we did see this war on terror. So let's think about why we did see the war on terror. What was going on there? Well, one thing that's going on there relates to traditional U.S. foreign policy as it relates to the Middle East. There is a long-standing guarantee that the United States has to secure several of the states within the Middle East and several of the states in OPEC. And this starts really after World War II. The United States President Franklin Roosevelt got on a boat, the USS Quincy, got on a boat and dealt with the King of Saudi Arabia, and made a promise that as long as Saudi Arabia continued to supply the world with energy, the U.S. would protect it indefinitely. That deepens in June 1974 when a historic deal is struck, off the record, being that was the King's choice, off the record between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The deal there was that the United States would protect the kingdom indefinitely, forever, from all adversaries, external and internal. The U.S. would give them indefinite protection. In exchange for that, the Saudis would have to guarantee that all oil sales that they would initiate would be settled in American dollars. That was the deal. And when they got those American dollars, they would then recycle the American dollars into U.S. debt, U.S. banks, and U.S. investments. That was the deal. And the Saudis were asked to try to convince many of their compatriots in OPEC to do the same. And in exchange for that, they got permanent defense. So what this did was it accomplished several things for the United States in the 1970s. At that point in time, the Soviet Union seemed like it was ascendant. At that point in time, the Soviets seemed to be making moves in Africa, seemed to be making moves in Asia, et cetera. But what this did was it imposed significant strains on the Soviet economy, which was largely dependent on energy exports. So the Saudis flooded the market with oil, as they're known to do from time to time. That caused significant economic dislocation for the Soviet Union, bankrupted them, and the U.S. helped the U.S. win the Cold War. In addition, what this did was it bankrupted Saudi Arabia's adversary, Iran, to the east, and helped contribute to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So this accomplished something for the Saudis, this accomplished something for the United States. But what this did was increase the security pressures in the Middle East, because once we had a new government in Iran, it committed itself to supporting liberation movements throughout the Middle East. So there's still this threat of terrorism, state-supported insurgency in the Middle East, though the U.S. adversary, the Soviet Union, was gone. So we're in this new situation after the end of the Cold War. The United States is in a supreme, unchallenged position of hegemony. And to put it in perspective, 90% of global transactions at that point were settled in American dollars. That means that whoever has American dollars has privilege over other individuals that have other types of currencies. The U.S. has incredible influence with this because the U.S. can create American currency and just transfer it over and sell it for goods and services, while other countries don't necessarily have that capability. So the U.S. gains enormous financial benefits from having this position of hegemony, which was supported by its control over global energy markets from that deal in the 1970s. The value of U.S. dollars and the willingness of other states to try to acquire those dollars allows the United States to perpetually maintain low interest rates, which is very good for any of you that are trying to finance your college education, very good for those of you that want to buy a home, very good for those of you that want to start a business. It keeps your interest rates low, all while the U.S. government can run pretty significant deficits, which again is beneficial for those of you that want to work in government. Right? So the U.S. was gaining something from this. The question at the end of the Cold War was, what was OPEC gaining? What were they gaining from continuing to maintain this deal? Why not sell their energy in euro? Why not sell their energy in RMB, which is China's currency? Why not sell it in anything else? Why not sell it in their own currencies? Why do they have to continue to support the United States when the security threat seems to be gone? The U.S. is getting something, but what is OPEC getting? That's the question that we're facing at the end of the Cold War. And if they're not getting anything, if OPEC isn't getting anything from this, why should they continue to maintain cooperation with the United States? Well, the thing that was going to help them maintain cooperation was terrorism. Terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. That was what was going to help them, right? Initially, the United States could offer protection from terrorists that were supported by Iran. After 9/11, it became protection from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda emerged in Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden, who led Al-Qaeda, was the son of a construction magnate that was politically tied into the regime and actually was quite cooperative with Saudi Arabia for some time. He fought on the side of the United States in Afghanistan, not directly supported by the United States, but he fought on the American side in the Afghan war in the 1980s against the Soviet Union. He then went back to Saudi Arabia, and when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he offered his services to Saudi Arabia to help expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. He and Saddam Hussein were not allies. Instead, the Saudis turned to their protector. They turned to the Americans, and the Americans deployed a large force onto Saudi Arabia to help expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. This, to Osama bin Laden, was sacrilege. So Osama bin Laden bringing American forces onto Saudi Arabia, which is the holiest site in Islam. It's the home to Mecca and Medina, right? Since putting American forces there was sacrilege. And at that point, he began to, since his philosophy started to emerge, that he concluded that the Saudi regime was an apostate regime, right, and a tool of the Americans, and a puppet regime. And he came up with his philosophy, which was that instead of fighting immediate problems within the Middle East, they needed to fight the Crusaders, the United States. That's what was the key thing. The first step to trying to rebuild what he viewed as the Islamic Caliphate, which was effectively once the Ottoman Empire, the first step to doing that was to expel the Americans out of the Middle East. Then their apostate allies would fall. That was his strategy. And if that's his strategy, he is then going to put himself in conflict with many states throughout the Middle East, who all fell under the U.S. security umbrella. And so he became an adversary of the United States. Even in the 1990s, with the Khobar Towers incident, with other incidents, with the bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, al-Qaeda was looked at as an adversary of the United States, including also the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. But after 9/11, that changed, because after 9/11, bin Laden demonstrated extraordinary capability, seemingly. Right? Those attacks were unprecedented, as I said, and it seemed like bin Laden had incredible power. And given that power and given that fear, the U.S. government had more capability to exert, in a sense, military deployments abroad. And so what the United States was willing to do at this point, because Americans were willing at this point to do anything to try to protect themselves against terrorism, the United States had an opportunity to extend its security guarantees to multiple states throughout the international system in order to maintain this system of protection for economic benefits that could sustain itself. And terrorism would be the thing that would lock it in. Before it was communism, now it could be terrorism and al-Qaeda. And what's interesting here, this is the map from my book, is that in the dark areas, the shaded states are ones that had an al-Qaeda presence appear right after 9/11. The arrows represent routes that are transit routes for global energy. You can see two things. One, right after 9/11, al-Qaeda seemed to spring up everywhere, which is not possible. Because after 9/11, or on the eve of 9/11, al-Qaeda, based on the State Department's estimate, was about 20,000 fighters. 20,000 fighters cannot occupy all that territory, right? They seemingly came everywhere. The other thing that you can see is that the states with al-Qaeda problems tend to align themselves on transit routes for global energy. Those are the states that were going to be needed to protect, right, for the United States to offer protection in exchange for these economic benefits. Right, so in a sense, al-Qaeda was the thing that would allow the United States to maintain its long-standing foreign policy, where the U.S. dollar would remain central in energy markets, which sustained this, since this American prosperity and hegemony. Okay, so the locus of this, the locus of al-Qaeda's activity, in order to maintain all this work, the U.S. had to try to suppress al-Qaeda in its home, which was here in Afghanistan. And after 9/11, when the Bush administration had to examine their plans for Afghanistan, there were no plans really. Really, the only agency that had any presence in Afghanistan was the CIA. DoD didn't really have that much of a presence in Afghanistan. The CIA did. This is a difficult area to actually prosecute a campaign in, a military campaign in. For one, the United States military is most capable when it can use its air power and sea power. Here, that's more difficult because it's in a landlocked area. The second thing about Afghanistan is it's not easy to access. To the west of Afghanistan, you have Iran, which had no intention of supporting any U.S. operations in Afghanistan or allowing the United States to use its airspace. So that's out. You can't get to Afghanistan from there. To the south, you have this long border with Pakistan, right? That was going to be necessary. If the United States wanted to make war in Afghanistan, if it wanted to fight in Afghanistan, it had to have Pakistan's cooperation. There was no other way about that. It had to have Pakistan's cooperation. The only other way in to Afghanistan was through the north, through Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, et cetera. And those were, in a sense, further away for the United States, so that doesn't help all that much. But the one way the U.S. could get some air supplies into Afghanistan was through a corridor that went over Russia. Right? And again, we all know Russia's relations with the United States today. Back then, they weren't as bad. But the question was, could you rely on a route which Vladimir Putin could try to shut down at any time? The U.S. had to. The U.S. had to rely on that route. But most importantly, if the U.S. was going to fight in Afghanistan, the Pakistan route was essential, critical. You could not fight a war in Afghanistan unless you had Pakistan's cooperation. There was no other way about that. And so as a result of that, in order to defeat al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Pakistan becomes an integral part of the American strategy. The two are interlinked. So when we think about the strategy here, The essential task that the Bush administration at the time was facing, the essential thing they needed to accomplish, was that they needed to destroy al-Qaeda and defeat the Taliban. The goal was to keep both entities out of the new government in Afghanistan and to keep them out of Pakistan. In Afghanistan, the U.S. started from scratch. It tried to rebuild a government in Afghanistan that had most of its power coming out of Kabul in the center. Traditionally, Afghan power centers tend to devolve into the localities. But here the goal was to build a strong central government in Kabul that would keep the Taliban out of power and keep al-Qaeda out of power and stop it from supporting al-Qaeda at all. In order to do that, the United States provided, in a sense, an indefinite security commitment to Afghanistan and its leader Hamid Karzai on the right. It provided him with an indefinite security guarantee. As long as he kept the Taliban out, as long as he refused to cooperate with al-Qaeda, the U.S. would protect him from all of his adversaries, internal and external. The same thing was given to Pakistan. As long as Pakistan cooperated with the United States, continued to allow transit, and fought al-Qaeda and the Taliban within its own territory, they would get an indefinite security commitment from the United States. So the Bush administration's strategy was not to fight directly with its own forces, but to arm the forces of Pervez Musharraf on the left of Pakistan and Hamid Karzai on the right. Give them the tools that they need to fight terrorism. That was the idea. So this did not work terribly well. So this is an analysis I did several years ago that was looking at the effectiveness of military aid in fighting terrorism. And what it was looking at was the hazard, or the instantaneous rate that a group collapses if the state that was fighting them is given military aid, and the cases where they're not given aid. At the top, the solid lines are the instances where host states that are fighting these terrorist groups are given no military aid at all. And what you can see is that the hazard that a group collapses is actually going up over time, which means that a group is more likely to fall apart over time if they're given no aid. Now, part of the reason for that, again, is that terrorist groups are dysfunctional. The other part of the reason is that states that don't get aid typically don't have that bad terrorist groups, They don't have groups that are terribly difficult. If you do give aid to terrorist groups, what you can see is that there's a proportional drop in the hazard that they collapse, meaning those groups are more difficult to deal with. But what you can also see is that the trajectory changes. If you give one of these states military assistance, the hazard, the likelihood that a group collapses starts to go down over time as opposed to up. So that suggests that the strategy of arming Pakistan, arming Afghanistan, giving them everything they need to fight terrorism was actually completely counterproductive if you look at the data. And these are U.S. government data, I didn't make these up. These are strictly data that are coming from the U.S. government itself. When you analyze them, it suggests that this strategy of fighting the war on terror is actually doing the opposite. It's encouraging these host states not to suppress their terrorist groups, or it's causing them so that they cannot. So why might that be? Well, in order to answer that question, let's think about it from both host states' perspectives. Let's think about it first from the perspective of Afghanistan's Hamid Karzai. He is governing a territory that has never been consolidated under a federal government. Never. He is governing a territory where his authority only basically extends to the gates of Kabul, if that. He doesn't have influence outside of Kabul. He is very vulnerable, and his power is completely dependent on the United States, who will only continue to support him if he has a Taliban or al-Qaeda problem. American protection is only going to continue if there's a terrorism problem. The United States had no real interest in continuing to supply Hamid Karzai with military assistance if there's no al-Qaeda there. None of you would support that, I would imagine. So if he only gets that military support, which is critical for him to stay in power, if al-Qaeda exists, or if the Taliban exists, you can't get rid of either. Hamid Karzai cannot get rid of either the Taliban or al-Qaeda, or he will lose all of his power altogether. If he does eliminate the Taliban or does eliminate al-Qaeda, the United States leaves. And if the U.S. leaves, he's finished. So his incentive is to keep this conflict going forever. His incentive is to never stop the war on terror. His incentive is to never try to disarm the Taliban or al-Qaeda fully. There is no incentive there to eliminate terrorism. This is a perverse set of incentives. By trying to strengthen Hamid Karzai, you are giving him an incentive to be weak. That was the fundamental flaw in U.S. strategy there. And what we can see is that there's some evidence from it based on what U.S. government officials were saying when they analyzed it. So in throughout 2009, when the Obama administration came to power, they started to do a critical Afghan review. throughout the entire year to try to analyze what was succeeding in Afghanistan and what was not succeeding in Afghanistan. And this is the quote from a cable that came from Ambassador Carl Eikenberry in November 2009. So I'll read it to you. It says that, from the cable, it said that, and this was not intended to be public, but from the cable, he said that President Karzai is not an adequate strategic partner. The proposed counterinsurgency strategy assumes an Afghan political leadership that is both able to take responsibility and to exert sovereignty in the furtherance of our goal. Yet Karzai continues to shun responsibility for any sovereign burden, whether defense, governance, or development. He and much of his circle do not want the U.S. to leave and are only too happy to see us invest further. They assume we covet their territory for a never-ending war on terror and for military bases to use against surrounding powers. That's exactly the sort of logic here, right? His assumption is that he can keep the United States there forever if he continues to fight terrorism forever. According to one of Eikenberry's other cables, he would be happy if the United States would stay there for 20 years, which the U.S. ultimately did. His strategy was to never end the war on terror. That is what was politically expedient to him. So now let's take a look at Pakistan's strategy. For Pakistan, again, it was essential for the United States to get Pakistan's cooperation. And from the position of the Bush administration, their argument was that by aiding Pakistan, we're aiding the conflict in Afghanistan. Pakistan is a necessary ally. What this fundamentally missed was what Pakistan really wanted in Afghanistan. Now remember, what the United States wanted to do was to create a strong central government in Afghanistan so it could govern its territory and free itself from al-Qaeda. That is the opposite of Pakistan's strategic doctrine. Pakistan's strategic doctrine is since very heavily, pretty much significantly, almost entirely focused on India. And from Pakistan's perspective, if there is a war with India, they are likely to lose. India has a much larger population and is much bigger. So their strategy has been focused on something called strategic depth. In the event of a conventional war with India, if India were to start invading Pakistani territory, the strategy was to start to retreat to southern and eastern Afghanistan. And from that mountainous territory, start to conduct guerrilla warfare against the Indians, so the Indians will eventually leave. The Pakistanis cannot do that if Afghanistan consolidates into a strong central state. The strong central state will stop them from crossing that border. That undermines their entire strategy. So we have a fundamental disagreement. The United States wants to build a strong Afghanistan. Pakistan wants a weak Afghanistan. It's the opposite. There was a complete failure, I think, to understand that for a long period of time in U.S. defense circles. They did eventually seem to get it, but by that time they were aware that Pakistan was being somewhat duplicitous in what it was doing. Now, to keep Afghanistan weak, Pakistan at one point was supporting the Taliban. The Taliban was in a large part their creation. Now, in this new environment, Pakistan started to support a variety of different groups, including the Quetta insurgency, the Haqqani network, and others that were intended to try to destabilize the southern part of Afghanistan, all for the purpose of maintaining this strategic depth argument. The interesting thing is that while they were doing this, they would turn around and tell the Americans, we're trying to fight, we're trying to win, we're trying to defeat these terrorists, but we can't do it. It's very difficult for us to do, you need to give us more resources. And the U.S. would give them more resources. And they would use the resources, point those at India, for the most part, and repeat the process over and over and over again. Pakistan's incentive, like Afghanistan, was never to end the war on terror, to never see success. Success was counterproductive. Both key parties that were essential to ending the war on terror never had an incentive to end it. Right? The U.S. was, in a sense, rewarding Pakistan for this behavior. So, to show some evidence of this from a quote, this is from Peter Lavoie in a classified briefing in November 2008 from the United States. His statement was, the Pakistani government institutions still support the Taliban in two key ways. They permit the Quetta Taliban Shura, the Taliban Leadership Council, to operate unfettered in the Baluchistan province. The Inter-Service Intelligence, the ISI, which is the equivalent, in a way equivalent to the American CIA, provides intelligence and financial support to insurgent groups, especially the Jalaluddin Haqqani network out of Miram Shah, North Waziristan, to conduct attacks in Afghanistan against the Afghan government, ISAF, and Indian targets. They knew, right? In a sense, based on this briefing, it was clear that Pakistan was engaging in this duplicitous behavior. So again, if we think about why this doesn't work, fundamentally we have a flaw. Afghanistan never has an incentive to do what the United States wants because that means an end to its regime. Pakistan never has an incentive to do what the United States wants because that ends its ability to compete with India and potentially compromises the strategic depth doctrine. So what happens? Again, at some point this is clear to the United States as to what's going on. But there's a transition that happens in 2008 to 2009, right? And this is the time of the Great Recession. At this time, the Great Recession starts to create an enormous demand for U.S. currency, so it looks like the United States will remain central in the world and will keep its position. We also see a pretty rapid and significant growth of American oil reserves. If you see by 2018, American oil reserves surpassed that of Saudi Arabia and of Russia, right? And we also see that the United States is increasingly focused on Asia. So all of these things mean that the United States will be okay if it focuses less on the security of the Middle East. There's less concern on preserving these regimes, keeping them together, keeping them stable overall. These different changes have caused changes in U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. still continues, though, right? The war still continues because the United States feels the need politically, again, to mitigate the risk of terrorism. From the perspective of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, et cetera, if there were, hypothetically, one of these terrorist attacks that happened, and they were seen as pulling out of Afghanistan, it's going to be their fault. Someone will hold them accountable. Someone will say they're weak on terrorism. Even though that's absurd, right? Even though the risk of terrorism is really low, they cannot afford to be seen as doing anything less. And so the war continues. It changes in shape, though. The United States withdraws to like rear bases, reduces its presence, allows the Afghans to engage in conflict. So casualties for the Americans fall precipitously when we move from 2014 to the present. But Afghan casualties were high. Right, so it's not like the war had ended. The Afghans were just doing the bulk of the fighting. Right, so it's a mistake to say this was costless. It wasn't costless. The Afghans were suffering. But as this continued, the Afghan state continued to weaken. The government got more corrupt. The position deteriorated. The Taliban started to make more gains. And as this was happening, Afghans were dying in significant numbers, though Americans were not after 2014. And so we can see here some data on fatalities, right? You can see that the bulk of the casualties in this war, the United States and U.S. contractors comprise about 5,300, 5,500 casualties. Again, every one of those is a tragedy. But if you look at the number of Afghans that were killed, it's over 70,000. They were the ones doing the fighting. And they were the ones doing the fighting in very large numbers after 2014. And their casualty rates were going up considerably. And so then we get to the end game. We get to about February 2020 when the Trump administration agrees to draw down U.S. forces by July and complete withdrawal by April 2021. President Biden follows along with this in July 2021 when he announces that he's going to proceed with the withdrawal, right, which was controversial. About a month later, the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan. The reason for this is not because the Afghan military just quit. It's because they understood if the Biden administration was going to withdraw, they had to start cutting their own deals to save their skin. So they start to cut deals with the Taliban. And as a result of that, the Afghan military looks like it just falls apart. But that was really all the result of negotiation. And then we did see political consequences. For some time, the Biden administration was looked at and characterized as weak on defense, incompetent in dealing with terrorism, unable to understand foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they still are, right? Those political consequences were realized, even long after Afghanistan really occupied a spot in American consciousness. So in that sense, there's an aftermath for it. There's a political cost to the United States. Strategically, the United States is still incredibly powerful in the world, no question about that. But now there is doubt about the U.S. security commitment, right? The U.S. security commitment, in exchange for instance, if it was going to get access to all these resources, if it's going to be denominated in dollars, it was supposed to provide indefinite security. I think it's fair to say now, especially after the Arab Spring, after Afghanistan, the ability of the United States to say, we will provide blanket security for you and you'll be okay, that's in doubt. I think that's fair to say. And one of the ways I can sort of really show you some evidence of this is to look at the Saudis, which are the linchpin of the system. Recently, the Saudis announced that they were considering accepting RMB for their oil, which is something they've never done, right? They've always maintained the peg between US dollars and oil, always. And now they're openly talking about switching, right, which is a source of concern, I would say. Less so than it was in the past, because now the U.S. is awash in oil, but that was a concern. For Pakistan, which was the sort of winner of this conflict, I guess, they now face continued instability in terms of their north. They're facing a growth of the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP. They're also facing incredible political turmoil. If you just read the news today, you'll see that they still have consistently problems in terms of maintaining their government. So that hasn't gone away as a result of this. And they still face considerable civil military tensions. But the worst of this falls on the Afghans, right? And honestly, in studying this conflict for quite some time, one thing that I've noticed consistently is that many scholars, when they talk about what the U.S. wanted in Afghanistan, what the Pakistanis did in Afghanistan, or if China's going to gain from this, or whoever's going to gain from this, what they forget is that there were people there that were doing the bulk of the fighting that are now suffering in droves. The Afghans are the ones that paid the price for this. They continue to pay the price for this. Where they pay the price is in this urban-rural divide in reaction to the Taliban first. The Taliban were much more popular in the rural areas. As they moved into the urban areas, this was a setback for many urban Afghans. Right? This was something that was tragic for them. What you soon seen globally throughout Afghanistan is that there's an economic collapse because Afghanistan's economy relied pretty much entirely on economic support, military support coming from the outside. It's gone after August 2021. And so the economy collapses. And after the economy collapses, the Taliban are left with nothing. They don't have any resources to govern. Their assets are frozen and basically in New York. And they start to face conflicts within their territory over the TTP with Pakistan and with ISIS-K. And as a result of them facing conflict, they have to raise resources. So who do they turn to? Well, they're under sanctions, so they got to turn to their people, which means more extortion against the Afghans. So they're facing more pressure from their government. And on top of that, the Biden administration a few months ago, announced that it was going to freeze Afghanistan's assets that were in New York and split the dividends. It was going to give some back maybe to the Afghans, but it was going to give some of those resources to 9/11 families, who many of them didn't ask for it. What that means is that wealth that was in Afghanistan is being taken away from them and given to Americans. They're already poor, right? You're already at 95% poverty rate. The limited assets they have are now being confiscated and taken away. So it is a cruel aftermath for the Afghans that they're facing. And right now, again, the difficult thing for me to tell you is that there doesn't seem to be a clear end in sight. I don't know how you get aid into Afghanistan given that the Taliban are there, right? And I don't know how you stop the Taliban from their behavior. What I can say is that there are several organizations that are actually doing a reasonable job of trying to provide assistance to the Afghans themselves, the people, not necessarily the government. And these are a few. I'm happy to share more with you if you like. But I will stop there and take questions. Thank you all very much for listening.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bapat, for that very interesting and really kind of mind-blowing presentation about what's been happening with the war on terror in Afghanistan in particular. So anybody have questions?
What is the difference between the Mujahideen and the Taliban, and why did a mutual beneficiary relationship turn into a war on terror?
Good question. So the Mujahideen were a set of groups that were operating against the communist government of Afghanistan from the late 1970s through the 1980s. Right, so at that time, Afghanistan was a Soviet client. The Soviets were supporting a regime in Kabul that was trying to adopt more of a communist orientation. When they intervened militarily to try to prop up that regime, that started a rebellion within Afghanistan that eventually became known as the Mujahideen. It received support from several different countries, including Pakistan and the United States. That was a heavy, again, none of the resources could have got into Afghanistan without Pakistan's cooperation, and that came from American support, from the Saudis, from others. So that was a group that was fighting the Soviets. The Taliban, some of those fighters were part of the Mujahideen, but they really emerged at the end of that war in the late 1980s. At that point, you see a split. At that point, the Taliban emerged largely with support from Pakistan, and they emerged in the south, and there starts to be a conflict between the Mujahideen and the Taliban, which the Taliban eventually, for the most part, prevailed. They were able to consolidate a large part of territory in Afghanistan under their control, but they continued to fight the Mujahideen until the war on terror started.
Any other questions?
Do you think that as time goes on, the U.S. or other Western allies will acknowledge the Taliban in any way, and what would be like the impacts of that if there isn't another governing body to step in at any point?
I think for the immediate future, it is very unlikely that any government recognizes the Taliban for two reasons. One, just given the political cost of doing so, right? Given that they're a very unpopular organization, understandably. Also, I think the United States is done with Afghanistan, doesn't want anything to do with it, and the Europeans are probably the same. But also, Ukraine has really crowded out that bandwidth, right? That's what I think the Europeans and the Americans are focusing on now. If the Taliban are going to gain any recognition, it will probably come from China and Russia. But what that means in terms of their ability to control what's going on in the Taliban is somewhat uncertain, because the Taliban were never a cohesive organization. They were a collection of multiple different insurgents groups, and over time their interests within that organization changed. Some are drug dealers. Some are really interested in a vision of Afghanistan that's very, very, that has this really strict interpretation of Islam. Some are smugglers. So even within the Taliban, you're seeing a lot of conflict. And then you have ISIS-K to add on top of it. So it's unlikely that something will consolidate that's clear. So I fear that means Afghanistan is going to face a very bleak future.
Yeah. Here you go.
Since Afghanistan's economy seemed to rely on United States input for the past 20 years, and now that financial input is gone, they've collapsed. How did the government function before the United States and before 2001, and why can't they go back to the systems or methods that they had then to be sustaining?
This is a good question. So before the United States intervened at a significant level, the government was at war with itself. The government was facing a civil war. The Taliban were in charge of the South. They were able to get some resources from the Pakistani ISI and some resources from donors throughout the Middle East. So that's something that helped sustain them. But again, their interests were pretty minimal, and they would tax the population for the rest. It was a very sustenance country. And then in other areas, there were Mujahideen fighters that had their own sustaining. They relied on some CIA payments and things like that. So it still was reliant on the outside. But over time, right, because there was so much of a financial flow into Afghanistan during the war, that built expectations, that built industries, that built, in a sense, individuals that had jobs and got used to those. So then when you take them away, that's a much bigger shock.
Saudi Arabia played an integral role in the rise of Al-Qaeda, Islamism, as well as jihadism. They are also playing an integral role in the Yemeni crisis right now. Since they are discussing taking or accepting payments in oil in the Chinese dollar, do you think they'll face any consequences from the U.S.?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that for sure. My sort of read on this from talking to some people I know in the U.S. government is right now that threat may not be serious, right? And the reason for that is that if the Saudis were to take only RMB, then they would get that currency, and then they would likely have to put it into the Chinese economy. And that's a much more unstable proposition than the U.S. economy, which has traditionally been very protective of property rights. So the U.S. economy still has those advantages in that since it's still a larger economy, the dollar is still more heavily used. It also has that protection of private property, whereas China doesn't have that. So right now, that might not even be a credible threat. But what I will say is that China is Saudi Arabia's largest customer for oil. At some point, it makes sense that they start to trade these things in RMB. And at that point, I don't know what the U.S. does, right? So I think it depends on how seriously American policymakers view this. What I can say is that there is variation amongst sort of at the higher levels, how much that connection between Saudi Arabia actually matters. Some view it as essential, and those tend to be the ones that really view oil as an essential commodity for the United States. Some may not so much, and may believe that the United States can get out of this through innovation, energy, et cetera, and that might be the opportunity to do so, if that answers your question.
You noted earlier about how America basically
started the war on terror in Afghan. But how do you think they would have sustained had America not invaded? Do you think like the Taliban or any other terrorist groups would have eventually taken over? Do you think Afghanistan would be in the same state that it is in today, or do you think they would have figured it out and been better off alone?
So that's a really good question. So Afghanistan was not in good shape before the United States, before Operation Enduring Freedom from the United States. It didn't have this level of poverty, though, right? And it didn't have this level of sort of isolation from the world. It was still isolated, but not at this level. Had the war on terror not happened, probably what would occur is that the Civil War was kind of in a state of stalemate to some extent, right? Massoud and the Northern Alliance had their part. They didn't have as much of Afghanistan as the Taliban did. But likely, I think there were some efforts by some to try to negotiate with the Taliban over recognition. They were only recognized by 2 countries. And so over time, if they stayed there long enough, and Afghanistan, which it does, holds sort of an entryway to the Caspian region, which is a new frontier for energy, I think at some point it's conceivable that someone would have to identify them or have to recognize them. Now, that's not to say that Taliban governance is good, right? Taliban governance has a lot, considerable problems with it that would be unacceptable to most in the West. And for good reason, right? So that part would have been consolidated had the Taliban been recognized. And what I guess you could hope is that there might eventually be some transition, but that doesn't seem likely. But what might have been avoided is the high level of poverty, which is ubiquitous, and the hunger, I think.
I understand we have all these programs for poverty, humanitarian aid, but with a country without a functional government or banking system, what do you think is the best approach to help the poverty, especially in Afghanistan?
So that's a great question, and it's a significant challenge because it's also a significant challenge when you have a functional government, right? So again, just as a side note, many of these organizations, which they rely on the private sector to try to help them, and which means that they have to deliver some tangibles. The problem is in dealing with something like alleviating hunger, there typically isn't a quick tangible that they can show. So they're often tempted to divert resources into programs that just do show, but not necessarily actually do the resources. So I think what it requires is an understanding on donors' parts that this is a long process, it's a difficult process, and any bit can help, though you're not going to see an immediate result necessarily. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it also relies on informal contacts in a lot of ways, right? That you can't necessarily go through the government, but if you know someone that can find a route that can connect you into some of the population, that's useful, right? And so those are the types of ways I think these organizations can help. Also, if the UN is willing, if the Taliban are willing to work with the UN on any circumstance, which right now, if the UN were to ask the Taliban, this is the time to ask because right now the Taliban are seemingly desperate, right? So at this point, if they can get any sort of relief, that's a moment where the UN would have some bargaining leverage. So that would be a moment where the UN food programs could potentially help.
Would that not result in them recognizing the Taliban?
It could. It certainly could, right? And that would be in exchange for recognition of the Taliban that would allow the UN perhaps to work unfettered. I don't know if that would be the specific things, but what I do know is right now, given the Taliban situation, they are more likely to offer concessions now than they would otherwise.
Did the Soviet-Afghan war impact the institutions in Afghanistan? Because like you mentioned before, that is when the militant groups sprung up in the country, and those are where the roots are for Taliban as well.
Yes, so the Soviet invasion, so the question is how did that shift the economy in Afghanistan? So before the Soviets invaded, Afghanistan was heading towards a more central planning type of government, right? Which if you look at again, my read on the history of Afghanistan is Afghanistan typically doesn't have a history of a centralized state. It's typically more of a federalized structure where there tends to be a lot more local governance. So an effort to try to consolidate that is what produced resistance to the Soviets in the first place. So that baked in, or since because that war was as intense as it is, one of the things that war does just generally is it crowds out the private sector because there needs to be so much spent on guns and bullets, and those don't produce anything that's a productive value. Those are consumption costs, and so they're lost. And then you see generations of people that are also lost in war. So that had long-term consequences for what Afghanistan would become, right, and what it would become after. And one thing we also know is that once civil wars start, they tend to restart. So that happens again in the 1990s with the Taliban, and then again in the 2000s when the U.S. intervened. So it just created, in a sense, a war economy, which Afghanistan is really plagued with right now. You have to imagine that after close to 30 years of war, productive skills on a large scale have really been crowded out. And if I were to ask any foreign multinational, do you want to invest in Afghanistan? The only ones that would are likely energy companies that want to be able to exploit, to get into Central Asia. So that really limits what Afghanistan can do economically. I'm sorry, go ahead, I want to interrupt you. So yeah, so the question was, did the war play a large role in producing terrorism in Afghanistan? It produced insurgency, it produced competition amongst militant groups. If we look at terrorism and we look at that specific definition of terrorism, which I would encourage everyone to do, because terrorism can be used politically for all sorts of different phenomena. Did it encourage groups to attack non-state actors non-state actors to attack non-combatant targets for political purposes? Maybe, but I think that link is a little bit more tenuous. Did it encourage violence and armed conflict? Yes, for sure.
I know Iran benefited a lot from the war in Iraq. Did they benefit in any way from what happened in Afghanistan?
I couldn't hear the first question.
Iran benefited a lot from what happened in Iraq, and I was wondering if they also benefited from what's happening or what happened in Afghanistan.
I think the answer is yes and no. Right? It's a bit complex. So what they did benefit from is that the U.S. is out of the region. So if you were to look at a map of the Middle East in 2005, 2006, what you would see is Iran was completely surrounded by a string of bases in Iraq and a string of bases in Afghanistan, which are on both sides of its border. So that's a very precarious security situation. So now the United States is still in Iraq, though not at the presence that it was. It went back after Obama withdrew. But now you don't have that on the east, right? So you don't have that U.S. presence on the east. So one security threat is taken care of. They also have been able to gain some cooperation with the Taliban so far, but that's not a natural partnership, right? The Taliban are not a Shia regime, right? They don't tend to be sympathetic to that. So since that's not a natural tie, so I think the Taliban will be looked at as a security concern, but that's not on the level of the United States. Having the U.S. there, I think, was the bigger security concern for Iran.
Well, I'll ask one too. Is there any signs of changed behavior by the Taliban, or are they incorporating any of the elements of the U.S.-supported government, or are they just treating them punitively?
It looks like the latter, unfortunately, that those that cooperated with the U.S. are looked at as traitors. And so I think we are seeing more punitive. And what's interesting is that when they first started emerging, they sort of tried to give assurances that they would not behave like that. But because they are so fractured as an organization, it's difficult to discipline that behavior. So we are seeing more of that, I believe.
I have two questions. Are U.S. interests better in the Middle East and North Africa now or before 9/11? And my second question is, could Afghanistan deteriorate into a Somalia-type situation? And if that does occur, can the United States even do anything about it?
So let me answer the second question first. If Afghanistan continues to deteriorate and starts to experience a surge in violence, the U.S., again, one thing about the United States that's worth mentioning is that the U.S. is the only country that has the capability to intervene basically globally. Most countries don't have that capability. So CENTCOM could start to engage in Afghanistan again. There probably is no political appetite to send ground forces into Afghanistan, really, for quite some time. That doesn't mean that the United States can't engage in attacks, can't engage in kinetic activity through the air, and it doesn't mean that the United States can't use its special forces, which have become quite effective in fighting some of these things. I don't think the United States will. I think right now, again, as long as President Biden is there, I think the United States is basically done with Afghanistan. And I would imagine that in the future that probably will remain the same regardless of who's in office. I don't think there's a big interest in Afghanistan anymore. So the first question was, is it, and please let me know if I'm not phrasing it right, are U.S. interests in a better position today in the Middle East and North Africa than they were? Is that the way? I think, like most things, the answer is yes and no, right? Again, if we argue that the United States has a strategic interest in the Middle East to try to make sure that there's a steady supply of energy flowing out and that there's a minimization of conflict and that terrorist groups are relatively controlled, on some dimensions that's true, right? But also the United States now has more of its own supply of energy, right? And the world is using less energy. So on those dimensions, you aren't as reliant on stability in the Middle East as the U.S. once was. But terrorism has gotten worse, right? Again, based on the data, terrorism is on an uptick since the war on terror happened. So if the goal is to try to maintain stability in the Middle East, that certainly hasn't happened. You add to it that many of these states are now looking away from the United States, right? Before, the U.S. was looked at as the protector in the Middle East. That's not necessarily true anymore. You're seeing more states look towards others like Russia or China who don't really have the military capability, and I think Russia's performance in Ukraine indicates that their security guarantees might not be as good, right? But you have states that are trying to look elsewhere and don't look at the U.S. as a reliable partner anymore. And so on that dimension, no, I think the U.S. is worse off as a result of the war.
All right, well, thank you for the fascinating talk, Professor Bapat, and thank you all for coming and asking really interesting questions.
Thank you all.